Welcome to the New York launch of the Reuters Institute Digital News Report. Thank you all for being here. I'm Paul Bascobert, president of Reuters. And on behalf of Reuters and the Reuters Institute, thank you for being here today. I know it's a little cliche to start with weather, but I do think today's weather is exceptionally warm and difficult to navigate through. But so thank you for taking time. Hopefully we'll reward you with an exceptionally cold room today. So we've got the air conditioning cranked. We've got great content. I think we're going to have a wonderful time together. At Reuters, we're really proud to be associated with the Digital News Report, the Reuters Institute. This is a really important piece of work that comes through every year at this time. And it's consistent with our mission at Reuters to bring fact-based journalism, fact-based news of the world to the world without fear or favor. It's core to what we do, and it's very consistent with who we are. It's also a really important service that we provide to the industry, an industry we care deeply about, and to all of you, and to try and be helpful in your pursuit to build successful businesses. As I thought about themes today, I sort of thought, what's the right way to capture the conversation today, to frame the information we're going to receive? And I thought about AI and transformation, but that's also a little cliche. I think we all hear it a lot. And so I'm going to suggest a different theme today, which is courage and leadership. And I think that those themes, as we go through the content of today, will actually be maybe more relevant. The Digital News Report grounds us in a reality of what our audiences are seeing. It grounds us in a reality of what they expect from us, what they're getting from us, and what they're choosing if we don't deliver those things. And as leaders, we have to have the courage to confront that reality, to address it, to think carefully about it, and to help our organizations respond to that. I'm old enough to remember early in a career when we used to talk about young readers coming out of college, that as soon as they got that first home, they're going to start subscribing to the newspaper. And then we told ourselves, as soon as they get a job, they're going to start taking serious news more seriously, and they'll start subscribing. We questioned whether or not anyone would actually watch TV on a phone. And so there's some fundamental things that we thought about. Now we think about, do they really know the difference between influencers and real news? And these are the themes that we're starting to see. And as leaders, we have to confront those. And expecting that somehow the world will come to their senses or somehow they will come to us is actually a reason for us to lose time, for us to lose audiences, and to lose trust. And so as leaders, it's important for us to embrace the changes and find our ways to build businesses that meet those needs. You're going to see some familiar themes today. You're going to hear about the growth of social. You're going to hear about the growth of influencers. You're going to hear about some fatigue in some of the products we're delivering to audiences today. And so there's a lot to process in terms of what the market is looking for. But there's also some really encouraging news that the market is looking for the best of who we are. They're looking for trust. They're looking for transparency. They're looking for truth. And so all of that really is who we are. And so in some ways, we need to think about the challenge before us as really a distribution challenge. How do we match the core things that we deliver with how the market wants to consume them? And when we talk about distribution, I think we need to challenge ourselves to go even earlier in the distribution channel, not thinking about, well, how do we get our linear stream in new places? Or how do we get our 400-word articles into new places? But to maybe even go earlier and think about the fundamental way in which we're communicating the important news that we discover, that we research, and that we find, and bring that to markets in forms that they may want. And so that, I think, is in some ways the challenges we see. But as leaders, we live in this gap. That is our job, to live in the gap between what the market wants from us and what the market sees from us, and to fill that gap with new products, new services, to challenge ourselves and to challenge our teams to find the new ways forward, to get our organizations around those new thinking, the new thinking that's in the market, to build the right products and services, and to just get going and start to fill that gap, because that's the opportunity that sits before us. In many ways, I would say today, the best thing I would suggest is to work backwards. As you see the information, you see what the market is looking for, work backwards from that to the products that you build today and think about, are there better ways to close the gap based on what the market wants today? I will say at the end, AI is by every means transformative. And so while I don't lead with that as a theme, I see AI as a means for us to fill that gap. It's an incredible technology that gives us incredible flexibility in the products we build. It gives us incredible performance on what we're able to do and a cost structure that could be very exciting and liberate us. So I want to leave with optimism that we have an opportunity here to think about an industry at a reset moment, using AI to fundamentally shift the game and to put us in a very strong position to fill the gap and deliver on the services that are needed. Let me just close by saying at Reuters, we are here for you. We understand the challenges. We are building our own tech and services. We're going through this migration with you. We have the benefit of Thomson Reuters, an enormous amount of investment in technology and AI that we can draft off of, and we are generous in our thinking about how to give that to all of you. So please, if you haven't, ask what are you doing? How could we be helpful? Are there experiments that we can share? Are there ideas that you have learned? We are here to help this industry. We care deeply about all of your success. You are our means to be successful, and so we need all of you to be successful, and we want to make sure you know that we're here for you. And let me just close with gratitude. Let me thank you all for being here today, and I'm really happy to see all of you taking the time today to think about the future of this industry. And so with that, let me turn it over to Richard Faulkner, Director of Research for the Reuters Institute, to give you the real content for the day. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Really pleased to be here to share with you some of the findings from our latest digital news report. This is our 14th report, and this year we've covered 48 media markets across the world. We were able to add Serbia to our data for the first time this year, and we think it's the largest ever survey representing around half the world's population. Just a quick reminder of the methodology before we dive in. The data comes from an online survey, and as such it will slightly underrepresent some traditional media behaviours, particularly in those markets which have lower levels of internet penetration, and especially so in the markets we include in Africa and also India, where the sample is representative of a younger, more educated English-speaking group. So do try to keep this in mind. The survey itself was conducted by YouGov in January, February 2025. And as ever, we're really grateful to our sponsors on the report, the Google News Initiative, which is our main sponsor, but also 18 other supporters, including the BBC, NHK, Ringier, Code for Africa, and a range of other regulators and media organizations and academic institutions from across the world. And of course, Reuters as well for their continuing sponsorship and for hosting us here this morning. So let's dive in. So a key theme of this year's report is the growing evidence that traditional media is losing reach, is losing influence to an alternative ecosystem that includes YouTubers and podcasters. And this is something that we can really clearly see in the United States. So this chart shows the weekly reach for some of the main sources of news over time. And we can see how television, print, but also online news websites and apps are all trending down, despite the fact that our polling took place in the Trump inauguration week. At the same time, we can see an increase over time in the use of social and video networks as a source of news, and particularly so in this last year, overtaking television for the first time. Now, last time, during the Trump first year of the Trump presidency, we saw all forms of media benefiting either in terms of an increase or perhaps just slowing the downward path. But this time, the surge has mainly been around social and video networks. On top of that, we can also see podcasts for the first time vying with radio in the United States, and also the emerging use of AI chatbots for news, 7%. So they used them for news in the last week in the US. Now, these are averages, but what we can do is ask people what their main source of news is and break this down by age. And when we do this, we see that older people, yes, are still sticking with TV, but younger people are increasingly preferring to access news via social and video networks. So 54% of 18 to 24s say that this is their main source of news, up 13 percentage points in just 1 year. And increasingly, we know that these groups are less likely to say they prefer online news websites and apps. So this is perhaps a sign of things to come. Now, linked to these trends, we can also measure the name recognition for a number of personalities around who distribute content not on TV, but exclusively via online platforms. So in our survey, 22% in the US said that they saw Joe Rogan discussing or commenting on the news in the last week. And if we look at his audience, we can see that it's disproportionately made up of young men, that same audience that traditional media is increasingly finding it hard to reach. Now, a key aspect of this is that the audience makeup is largely partisan. So the top 5 names on this list have mainly right-leaning audiences. We do see some with left-leaning audiences in our survey, but nonetheless, we still see this partisan element. Now, you may be wondering, is this happening elsewhere across the world? Well, broadly speaking, we do see similar trends in some countries. So this chart shows the proportion of people in selected countries that say that social media and video networks are their main source of news over time. And what we can see is that the US is increasingly joining a set of countries such as Brazil, India, Indonesia, where these trends around influencers have been evident for some time. On the other hand, if we look to Europe and Japan, we see a slightly different picture. Where social media tends to be used less for news and traditional brands still play a more important role. However, we can see that over time that the social and video networks are gaining ground. Now, I think it's really important to be clear that this isn't just about partisan politics. These trends are also driving a lot of creativity in terms of formats and giving opportunities to new voices. One example that we've been tracking for some time now is Hugo Travers, or Hugo Decrypt, in France. He's a young creator who reaches around a fifth of under 35s in France each week. And this has enabled him to get access to politicians and presidents. So he was recently invited to put his question to President Trump in Paris, for example. And this is something that, of course, that only traditional media would have been able to do not so long ago. And throughout our survey, we've been able to identify influencers and creators in many different countries. This is something we want to do more work on. And I think it's striking that so many of them are men, using this kind of extended chat format. But it's also important to note that in countries like India, creators are able to offer different perspectives that are more critical of the government than traditional media. And in Thailand, for example, online influencers like these are expanding the range of the debate, which might have been difficult in a quite a controlled media environment in the past. Now, linked to the rise of the creator economy and also the change of administration in the US, we're seeing platform companies change their strategies in terms of what they like to promote and what this looks like in terms of content moderation and fact-checking. But just a reminder of the bigger picture first. So this chart shows the weekly use for news for different social media and video networks over time across 12 markets where we've got the most long-term data. Now, you can clearly see that Facebook remains the most important network, though of course its influence has been declining in recent years as attention becomes more fragmented over a wider range of networks. So the big growth, and we did talk about this last year, but the big growth has been in Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, which are of course primarily video networks, but also less about referrals. Interesting, I think, that X has not really declined. We didn't see that in our data, at least in terms of weekly reach. And the impact of newer networks like Blue Sky, for example, is still pretty minimal. One interesting side note on X, that although the overall reach has remained roughly stable, if we average the data across 12 countries, we can see that the audience makeup has changed quite significantly in recent years. So Jack Dorsey's Twitter used to be more about people on the left, some of whom have moved elsewhere, of course, but a roughly similar number have been attracted to the network, for example, by Elon Musk's promises around free speech. So we can see that left-right composition change in recent years. Now, another important question for us is, where do people pay attention when they're using networks like X? Are they looking at news organizations, politicians, different kinds of creators, either ones that focus on news or perhaps just talk about news occasionally? And again, we can see that there's quite a difference in scale between the UK and the US. So in the UK, people are still paying quite a lot of attention to traditional news organizations like the BBC, like Sky, and less so to other actors. But we can see a different story in the US, where there's a much larger role for alternative creators and influencers, as well as politicians. Now, just as a side note, we changed the way we asked this question this year to split out creators into those that mainly focus on news or talk about news occasionally. And you can see by comparing the blue bar to the grey bar that actually when people are answering this question, they're often thinking about those news-focused creators. Now, another topical debate is whether platforms like X should be removing more or less content that is seen as being harmful, even if it's not necessarily illegal. And of course, this is a big tension point between Europe and the US, with Meta responding to that pressure with changes to its content moderation policy. But what does the public think about this issue? Well, overall, we find that people are more likely to think that too little is being removed from social networks than too much. And this is especially the case in countries like the UK and Germany, where there's clearly a desire for more intervention and more moderation. In the US, in fact, it's actually quite an even picture as well in the aggregate. But if we look at the split by left-right, we can see quite clear political differences, with those on the left thinking that too little is being removed, and those on the right thinking that too much is being removed. Nearly half in each case think this way. So now let's look in a bit more detail at video. And this year we brought back a question on preferences for news consumption online. When you're online, do you prefer to listen to the news? Do you prefer to read the news? Or do you prefer to watch it? Well, if we look in the average, we can see that still the majority of people, 55%, say that they prefer to read the news. But it's important to realize that this is being driven by markets like Norway and the UK, where around 3/4 say they still prefer to read the news online. But if we look at some of the other markets we include in our data, we can see the Philippines, Mexico, and Indonesia, where the preference for watching is much stronger, and it's actually larger than the preference for reading. So this is boosting that growth in video. In terms of podcasts, of course, we've seen significant investment in recent years from publishers that are really trying to chase that younger, richer audience. In the US, 15% say that they consumed a news-related podcast in the last week. And when we dig down into the shows that people listen to, we can see a kind of split between what we might think of as brand-led traditional news podcasts and those which are more personality-driven, which I mentioned earlier. In the UK, the market is much smaller, 7% say they accessed a news podcast in the last week. And here, the most mentioned podcasts tend to be personality-led to some extent, but also published by the BBC and other traditional brands. Many of them are available in video, but nonetheless, the majority of the listening is still done via audio platforms like the BBC Sounds' own app or Spotify. Now, moving now to the question of misinformation and disinformation. This year, we wanted to take a new approach and get a sense of how people check and verify information when they're online. Where do they go and what do they do? Now, it's important to say that we know that people don't always check information online. So we asked them, if you did want to do that, and when you do this, where would you go? And we can see a clear hierarchy of intent. So at the top, we see news sources that people trust, alongside official sources like government websites. And this is true as well, you can see from the table, both for older people and for younger people as well. So there is still something about the reputation, the heritage that remains important, particularly at sort of crunch times. We do, however, see some interesting differences around some of these by age. So with younger users, they're more likely to say they go to social media to check, more likely to look at the comments from other users, and interestingly, more likely to check using an AI chatbot as well. This begs the question of what people mean when they say trusted brands, and really it seems to be brands with a track record in breaking news, and particularly that we see a very strong showing for public broadcasters in many of the countries we looked at. But of course, it's a slightly different story in the US, which is more about which political side you're on. Brand recognition for fact-checking, dedicated fact-checking brands is a lot lower, but still featured in the data. And we can also see brands like BBC Verify cutting through alongside these other fact-checking brands. That brings us on to trust. And I think the good news this year is that trust is stable. So 40% of people across the 48 markets we look at say that they trust most news most of the time. That figure is a bit lower in the US at 30%. But we can also look at the sort of patterns of trust over time. And we can see, for example, in the UK, where there's a pattern we see in many other countries as well, we saw a sharp decline in trust in the pre-pandemic years from 2015 to 2019, then a bump during the pandemic where trust increased by a few percentage points. And as you can see from then on, it's been roughly stable at around 35%. The data in the US is slightly unusual because we didn't see that pandemic bump, and the numbers haven't really changed very much since 2015, although there is sort of activity under the surface if you look at the left-right data. And we can also see a slightly different pattern in countries like Norway and Finland. Again, we see that pandemic bump and then stability, but also crucially much higher levels of trust. So 67% of people in Finland, one of the highest scores in our data, say they trust most news most of the time. One of the key questions we asked this year is what the media could do to try to increase trust. We asked this using an open-ended question. We didn't want to sort of lead people down certain pathways, but nonetheless, we came up with quite similar results to those we've highlighted in the past. So when we coded them up, we saw clearly a desire for impartiality. People worry that the media has biases or hidden agendas wrapped up in loaded language, and they just want the facts so they can make up their own minds. Secondly, accuracy, verification, and it's interesting, as I mentioned earlier, to see some publishers really doubling down on these themes. Greater transparency was also important. The public want journalists to show they're working, they want better labeling of conflicts of interests, and so on. And then finally, more distinctive journalism. So more journalism that's more deeply rooted in stories, less clickbait, less sensationalism. And of course, this is all pretty consistent with what journalists themselves would like the news to be. But of course, it's not necessarily what the public feel they're getting right now. Another big theme, of course, is AI. And what we've picked up this year is the use of AI as a source of news. Now, this, of course, is very hard to ask about in a survey because sometimes the public aren't aware that their answers in overviews, for example, are being generated by AI. But when we focus specifically on chatbots, 7% across markets say that they've used a chatbot to access some kind of news in the last week. And this figure is twice as high for those under 25 years of age. As we discussed last year, people in most countries are uncomfortable in the most part with the idea of AI being used in situations where AI is creating the content. Even if there's some kind of human oversight, you can see the red bars, both US and Europe, nearly half of people saying that they're uncomfortable with news being made in this way. But interestingly, the public are more accepting of the idea that AI can be used to assist journalists in their work in more of a supportive role. So in fact, the picture around comfort almost completely inverts in this alternative scenario. So the nuance, is really important for the public. In terms of what underpins these views, we also asked a question on how people think the use of AI in news changes, whether it makes news more or less accurate, more or less cheaper to make, and so on. And what you can see is that although people do think AI makes the news cheaper to make, potentially more up to date and easier to understand, they also think that AI will make news less transparent, less accurate, and less trustworthy. Finally, on paying for news, each year we ask about the proportion who pay for any kind of news, whether it's subscription, membership, or donation. If we look at the level of payment across these 19 selected markets, we've seen no real change in the average at 18%. Of course, there's activity for different publishers under the surface, but the overall picture is very stable. Norway and Sweden are still outliers to some extent, where we see considerably higher levels of payment for online news, but overall, not much change this year. This year, we also asked non-payers what might persuade them to pay in the future. And we do find some evidence that some people might be tempted by the bundling of different publications for a reasonable price. For others, the idea of additional services like beyond news, like sports and games, might tempt them to pay. And a few others might be tempted to pay for single articles. But again, as we've pointed out before, a large group of people, 71% in the US, of non-payers, said that nothing would convince them to pay in the future. So just to wrap up, clearly this year we've seen media losing influence in some countries as politicians and creators tap into an alternative ecosystem. Video and audio formats becoming more important, especially with younger audiences. Trust is stable, and audiences clearly see value in traditional news brands when the time is right. But how can trust levels be increased? AI chatbots starting to be used as a source of news. There are really important questions about how this changes the access model going forward. And finally, subscriptions remain stalled. The majority aren't paying, but are there other opportunities around new strategies like bundling and flexible payments? Thank you very much for listening. With that, I'll hand it over to Rasmus, who will chair the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard, for the presentation, and to Paul for the introduction. And thanks all of you, as Paul said, for taking time this warm morning. So this, I think, is really where the magic begins, right? This is where we take the work on the road and have conversations about what it means for you. And to get us started on that conversation about courage and leadership, really pleased to have Caroline here with us, managing editor at the New York Times, Sally as North American news editor at Reuters, and Kevin as director of the Americas at BBC News, to give some initial responses to how they think about the findings this year from their vantage point. And then I'll make sure we open up towards the end of this to make sure we get questions, ideas, and input from all the great people in the room.
My initial reaction is I'm going to move to Norway based on that research.
I promise I did not set this up, but I came straight from Oslo, actually, from this, and it was raining cats and dogs and 12 degrees Celsius, so it would be nice more than one way. But maybe let's start with the sort of the top line this year. I think it feels very pertinent here in the US in particular, the rise of influencers who now in some cases rival institutional media in terms of reach, and also where I think we see very clearly some very sort of symbiotic relationships between some individual influencers and top politicians. I'd love to hear maybe with you first, Caroline, how you think about this from your point of view. How does one adapt to this? Can one leverage this from the New York Times point of view? And then we'll hear from Kevin and Sally.
Sure. First of all, we are obsessed with this question right now, trust. In fact, we just appointed a masthead editor to lead our kind of understanding of trust in our relationship with our audience. I do think that there are certain things we can learn. We are not influencers for a whole bunch of reasons. One of them is ethical rigor, the expectations from our audience. But here's a few things that we can learn. So this market research, this is a long time ago, was looking at news organizations, traditional ones like the New York Times, and they seemed, especially among young readers, very distant, very cold, in some ways very institutional, rich, well-resourced, and very inhuman. So when you think about the New York Times now, in your experience, it is much more human. You can have, at the close of the Trump trial in Manhattan, Maggie Haberman describing to you on video what happened, why it matters. You can have Michael Barbaro, who a lot of people trust every day, to explain it the next day. There are a lot of ways that we can speak much more directly in a less stodgy, less stuffy way, directly to readers' needs in the moment, and use our expertise and explain our expertise to our readership. And I feel like, as people consume more on all of these platforms, meeting readers where they are and where they need their information is a really key thing, and that's what we're thinking about.
Great. Sally, do you want to give a view on this?
I think that in addition to what Caroline said, what I'm always struck in these things, and you said the question, Richard said the question was open-ended this year, the request for transparency. And I think one of the things we have to be sort of honest with ourselves about is that while I think we've all made progress at transparency, we actually are probably still lagging behind the actual audience demand and sort of, like table stakes for transparency, right? And I think I told Rasmus earlier, the most intriguing thing from this report to me, because you're always kind of looking for the little signals of hope, what can we actually do here to make a difference, is this idea that people actually still sort of go to traditional or whatever they think of as where they go to credible fact-based news organizations when they actually want to check something, okay? But are we really clear? Are we delineating, hey, you know what? We actually have people on the ground in, let's say, Ukraine, and we saw this eyewitness. If you are sort of casually, like you're trying to check something out and you come to, our websites or whatever, is that actually clear? Is that apparent? Is it right in their face? Or do you kind of have to search for our standards, all that kind of thing? I think, so what do we do with how do we look for solutions in that? I think that putting our standards, like here's what our principles are, for example, for us, the Reuters Trust principles, like making those just like in people's faces rather than buried somewhere is a, are they written so informally that like young people can actually understand them? And then one of the things I'm in the process of trying to do right now, still not totally successfully, but is around something like the tax bill, right? Which is incredibly consequential to every single person in the United States and is largely, when you look at the surveys, people aren't even aware that it's being debated, okay? So we're trying to put literally the youngest, smartest reporter who we have on the Hill and have him do a little vertical video explainer every day, right? And it's hard because we have a lot of news going on. So the news environment is not helping all of our sort of strategic thinking at this moment or anything like that. But I was saying, like, how can you break through? I'm not sure our stories are going to break through right now. I'm not sure anyone's going to read them except extremely scrupulous people. And so, like, how can we break through to say, hey, today on the Hill, we're talking about what Social Security is going to, like, the impact of this is how Social Security is going to look in terms of, financing the debt going forward 20 years from now. And so I think we're all trying to grasp for like short-term solutions because we know what the problems are, but our systems still aren't 100% great to overcome them, I would say. So, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think one thing is that the rise of the influencers, which I don't think is really a sudden rise. I think we all clocked onto it last year because of the election, but it's been something that's happening over time, is that I think it reveals a desire from audiences to hear the news and information as part of their routines from people that they trust and build direct relationships with. And I think the challenge for us is how do they build those direct relationships with our journalists? I mean, at the BBC, as a broadcaster, this is not new to us. We've had presenters, correspondents, reporters fronting our news for 104 years, and we are used to putting those faces and those voices in front of people. We're used to being on radio, which is incredibly intimate. And we have been in places like TikTok for several years now, putting our reporters in front of the audience directly. So I think that's one thing. It's a challenge to build those relationships directly, but it's something we can do. For example, at the Diddy trial, in this city, which is a huge story for younger audiences, we have a podcast host who's been there every day of the trial, and she does a social video and a podcast every single day. And that has a loyal, extremely young audience. We run that as a once a week video version as well, which runs on iPlayer and other platforms. And that kind of thing, which you may not see, you may not associate the BBC with our sort of, our reputation as a quote unquote legacy news provider. But those kinds of things as a public service news organization, we absolutely have to do. And because our customer base, our audience, are the license fees payers in the UK, we have to serve all of them, whether they are 16 or 60, whether they're consuming first on TikTok or coming directly to our website or our TV news bulletins. Did you want to comment, Karen?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that this makes me think of, I started out covering small towns in Massachusetts, and I had this very grouchy editor, and he would always say to me when I was turning in my stories, how do you know what you know? And when you quoted someone, how do they know what they know? And I feel like explaining to readers more regularly how we know what we know. I'm looking at two of my colleagues here, Matt Erickson and Charo, and they have worked a lot on non-traditional story forms, especially graphics, that tend to be very direct about what are the sources of this information, what kind of calculations did we do, and we kind of walk people through that. And I feel like sometimes we forget the obligation to do that in news stories and sort of it's really fundamental. And when you look at why are people going to ChatGPT or other chatbots, because they're kind of frank about like where the information is coming from.
I'm keen to get your perspectives on the other side of this shift that we're seeing towards influencers, because of course part of it is a whole slew of influencers who are putting themselves out there and parts of the public turning towards them, not always at the expense of other sources, but sometimes. But arguably another side of it is a platform preference for influencers. I mean, I don't think that's surprising, right? If you run a platform company, you'd rather deal with a multitude of precarious influencers than you deal with a consolidated industry of incumbents with lawyers. I mean, it's not that surprising. And we are seeing, I think in some ways, a more fragmented and perhaps in a few respects competitive platform space than we've seen in a few years. But that also, I think, challenges the returns on investment for a lot of publishers in terms of what you're actually getting when you make the choice to try to reach people through these platforms. And of course, we're also seeing the platforms themselves becoming extremely explicitly politicized sometimes now in ways that can be very divisive, in ways that are much more pronounced than they were even in the recent past. So I'd just be curious to hear, I mean, all of you in different ways are trying to reach people via the platforms where you compete with influencers that the platforms are very keen on. Of how you sort of think about navigating this evolving platform environment that Richard described. I mean, Kevin, maybe we'll start with you. Sorry, I'll pass the...
Yeah, I mean, I think we fundamentally want people to consume BBC journalism on BBC platforms, that we want that. We also have to be, as Karen said, where the audiences are. And I think on the trust point, people need to bump into us, and they will bump into us on platforms. So alongside this news that they're getting from influencers who we know that the survey shows that the audience's biggest fear of misinformation, along with politicians, comes from those influencers. So while they're consuming content from these influencers, they also know a lot of the time they can't trust these influencers. So as they're swiping along, if they're also coming across BBC content, and we have an incredible position of trust in this market and in globally as well, they know they can trust that content. And we know also from the survey that they're coming to brands like us to double check things that they've heard or seen and make sure that they're true. So we have to be on the platforms, so they're coming to us and bumping into us. And I think we see a big desire from audiences to follow us directly. You know, we have 9 million followers on TikTok. So they're not just bumping into us, they're also actively following us. You know, BBC Persian, our Iranian service, has 22 million followers on Instagram. We're reaching huge numbers on these platforms in times of crisis around the world, and people who want to get reliable information. And we're providing that to them, not just in English, but in lots and lots of other languages. So I think, and in different markets, the different sort of equation of which platforms we need to be on and to what extent, and to the extent that we want to pull people back onto our own platforms will be different. It'll be a different equation, and we operate all around the world. So I don't think it's a straightforward answer in any one market, but I think, you know, my fundamental point would be we have to be there, and we have to compete in these spaces, and we have to provide trusted, independent, impartial information in these spaces.
Sally, things are a bit different from an agency point of view, but Reuters is trying to build a stronger business-to-consumer business as well, and value proposition. How do you think about this, navigating this?
I mean, very similar really to what Kevin was saying. And obviously we think, you know, partially about serving our agency customers, but also when we're thinking about direct to consumer. And I also think that like brand awareness is important, not just for direct to consumer, but also, you know, for the trust that other news organizations have for us when they you know, buy our stuff, when they use our stuff, right? And I think, I mean, one of the super interesting things about this is that people are definitely becoming more fragmented in their news things, but I have like a small little bit of hope that they are actually looking for, you know, good and interesting information, and they have more choices. And so that means that if you can convince them, like for somebody like us, that we're credible, that we're fact-based, that we're nonpartisan, that we are, you know, both global and also in communities, okay, that we have boots on the ground, literally in a lot of places, and we say that. I think that you can sort of build a following of trust, even if you are essentially, you know, going through other news organizations. When it comes to direct to consumer, I completely agree with everything Kevin just said. I also think that, you know, a lot of places are looking at whether there can be like networks of influencers that they can have some relationship with or something like that. That's obviously a thing that people are looking at. I'm also really intrigued with the idea of whether we as an industry need to sort of be more friendly to influencers and sort of like offer training, I told you when I was at Neiman last fall, there was a guy there who was studying, and he was trying to put together essentially like like sort of a basic package of sort of journalism training 101, 5 minutes on ethics, 5 minutes on how you check facts, and trying to essentially think if nonprofit news organizations might be interested in using something like that. Let's say you're the nonprofit in Pittsburgh. I'm completely making this up. Would it be useful to you to have like a network of local influencers? And would you be interested in helping them in a non-patronizing way raise their standards? Would that be good for journalism overall? And I'm super intrigued by things like that. That doesn't necessarily, but I think that there are ways, stringers and influencers are not the same, but are there ways that we could actually be more friendly toward influencers and sort of help raise their game that would work? I'm intrigued by that idea, but don't know exactly where to take it. So
I would just add one thing, which I feel like it's a subtle thing and you need to sort of walk a line, right? Everything that we do on platforms that are not our own has to sort of be an investment in a relationship that we hope will deepen a connection so that eventually people come to us. And so if we're on YouTube, if we're doing things on other platforms, TikTok, et cetera, what we're trying to do is connect, and we're trying to show our expertise, and eventually we want people to come directly to us. But it's sort of like, how much do you invest in those platforms in a way that makes people attracted to you and deepens their trust in you?
let me add one thing to that, because I think that's such an important point. I think what we're really trying to do is, we all know that a lot of what influencers talk about is probably the journalism of people like us, right? They're like, we are actually gathering the facts and then they're sort of riffing off of them. And that's kind of what I mean by, is there a way to deepen that relationship? So this is not just like, we're not saying like, it's exactly that. Like, how do you actually get benefit from, at core, these are people who are talking about news and news adjacent things, right? And is there a way for them to, I don't know, refer to us more, have relationships with us that are more conducive? I have no idea if this would work. I can't see the monetary payoff right off the bat, but it does seem like we're not going to be able to like resist this. It's not going away. So we have to figure out a way to make it positive.
I'd love to push you a little bit on this. I hear what you say, Caroline, and I think that the logic is very clear. And I've got like 3 mics now. It's incredible. I could go undercover. You'd never hear the end of it. Take X. Publishers have been on X for more than a decade. X has never delivered meaningful referral traffic. This is a fact. Anyone who's looked at analytics will know that. And yet, publishers have remained on X for more than a decade. They've remained on X even after the platform, from the point of view of many publishers, were greatly diminished after Elon Musk took over and changed a number of things, both how it works, how content is moderated, the user base and whatnot. Still, publishers remain on X. And even with the minuscule referral traffic it does generate and the off-site reach it generates, it's often exceedingly hard to document whether any of it actually results in any conversion to direct relationships. So I like what you say, but I wonder, as your old editor would ask, how do we know that it works that way? And if we suspect that it doesn't, what are we to make of the fact that almost every major publisher remains active on platforms that generate no referrals and where we have no way of knowing whether, in fact, the reach converts to anything more tangible?
I would have to look at our most recent audience data. I do think that during some high news periods that it might spike a tiny bit more than usual. I think that we have, as a newsroom, pulled back from X and other social media dramatically, starting about 3 years ago. And we told people that they did not have to do this as part of their jobs. Part of the least desirable part of my old job was policing our staff on social media and being sort of the gendarmes for when people stepped over the line. And I am happy to report that, that is very much a part-time job now. People are not doing it, and people are not getting in Twitter spats, X spats as much. I sort of leave it to the business side people and to the audience people, whether there's some marginal effect in high news periods of having, a broad number of platforms. But I would say that as an institution and as a newsroom, we're not engaging or sort of obsessing about these platforms, especially X.
Just to be clear, I was not suggesting it's wrong to stay on X. I'm probing a little bit whether the logic is as it's often described. I mean, it seems to me that there is another case for remaining on X, which is that you want to be part of the conversation, even if it doesn't actually translate into anything tangible. Well, thank you. Thank you. It's 2 mics is clearly not enough. Does anyone else want to take my bait on this? X as an example, but it's not only X. I mean, there are several of the platforms people have invested in the recent years, as Richard said, do not drive meaningful referrals, and yet publishers moved in, even knowing what we know from 25 years of terms of trade that we continuously been quite unhappy with.
I mean, we need to be part of the conversation. I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's an ideal situation. I think it's a really, difficult situation, but we have to be part of the conversation. I mean, one of the things, there was one data point that just leapt out at me, that something about young people and a certain, I think it was TikTok and young people or something like that. And it was just like, oh, I know, but like when you look at the print numbers, I love the way you did the graphic of the print numbers and the TV numbers. I mean, this is just like starkly coming at us, right? I mean, I think that we all believe that our brand names and what we actually do, what is behind those brand names, which is that we have standards and we don't have conflicts of interest and we check our facts. And largely speaking, we are, fairly good at nonpartisan, you don't know our opinion when we write our stories. I mean, nobody's perfect, but we still believe in those things, and the vast majority of our journalists still believe in those things, right? I don't think we want us to disappear from the face of the earth. I think we have to be, if everyone who is under the age of this is going to consume news through video, social media, and those platforms are going to change every year. This is just the wild ride we're on. That's the way I feel about it. It's not fun necessarily from a business point of view, but it seems to me so much more important than it even was 30 years ago, basically. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly on X. I mean, I think it's we have something ridiculous like 30 million followers on the BBC Breaking News account on X. It's automated. When we send in an alert notification, it goes out there. We would be silly to give that up, but are we putting any meaningful resource into X now? No, but why would we kind of pull back entirely, right? I think we need to be putting our resources in the places where we can create meaningful interaction with audiences, direct interaction with audiences. A lot of us have gone into WhatsApp in the last year or two. That is an intimate place to be when people are messaging their friends and family, getting news updates alongside that, and opting into it directly. And I think that's a really possibly valuable channel. Maybe even not for huge amounts of referrals, but in terms of brand awareness, direct relationships, in the same way that habit building in a kind of the way that newsletters do. I think that has huge potential, and we've gone in on WhatsApp. So I think it's not an and/or. We need to be in all these platforms, but how much resource you put into each one is kind of up to you.
So I have so many more questions I want to ask you about whether the news business increasingly is built on serving primarily people like me, who are sort of middle-aged and rich and well-educated and metropolitan, what we should make of the trust, and whether generative AI it really is, as one Nordic publisher told me yesterday, news media killing machines. But I would much rather hear questions from the room than have me monopolize the conversation here. So this is where we open it up. If I play my cards right, I'll have 4 mics by the end of the day. But before we get to that point, if you have something that you want to sort of ask any of the panelists or Richard and myself from the Reuters team, now is a good time to raise your hand, tell us who you are, and tell us your question.
Hi, I'm Carla Zanoni, and I head up the engagement journalism program at the Newmark Graduate School. And I former audience head, and I am so struck that we haven't talked about the political mix of what you were showing here from the perspective of platform reach. So when, I forget what the exact stat is, but I know when we looked at the election last year in the US, the majority of the media reach is to the right, center right, far right. So when I think about platforms and I think about reaching audience, I get a little bit concerned when we're pulling back from platforms that might have a more broad political spectrum of engagement. And I'm just wondering how do we remain unbiased, reach those audiences, and have meaningful engagement with people who maybe don't agree with us? How are you thinking about that?
Any takers?
I mean, this is part of what the person we just put on the masthead, Pat Healy, who comes out of the world of politics, is thinking about. But where do we need to be to tell our story and to explain what we do? And I think, the polarization of this country might mean that there is a percentage, I hope tiny, that will never listen to us. But I think there are a lot of people kind of in that broad middle who don't actually know our story, but are curious enough about the world, that need news, that might be open if we can sort of explain what we do and what we don't do and how we do it. So finding ways to be in the right places, like if Pat goes on more podcasts or is on YouTube or writes directly to readers or prospective readers, I think that is sort of like exactly what you're getting at. Like, we can't give up on, just because the country is polarized, we can't give up on reaching people who might not automatically subscribe to us. And so that's a lot of where our effort and our energy is going.
Yeah, I mean, I think you ask a question that we all, agonize over all the time. I mean, when I joined Reuters, I thought that because there's so much polarization in a place like the United States, right, and it doesn't appear that it's going away anytime soon, if there's a possibility to say, this is who we are, this is what our standards are. We are literally trying to, tell stories that are, fair and deep and not he said, she said, but that are nonpartisan as possible to be. And if you could sort of make people understand your standards and that you were doing that there's some opportunity there. We all know that it is a difficult opportunity. We're not being Pollyannish about any of this or anything like that. But to me, this is just like a worthwhile thing to be realistic, but very resilient and determined about going forward, right? I think this is one of the big, and I do think that's why I said that moment where it's like when people are questioning if something is real, that's when they're looking for, they still sort of, like, the numbers were startling. They kind of still default to, like, quote unquote legacy media or something like that. And so I don't think that means that, we just travel around and fact check everything, but I think that that is an opportunity that we could try to figure out ways to insert ourselves at those moments and to be more transparent about how our standards are different. And it can't be, we can't be like, our standards are better. It can't be like that old way to do it. It has to be something that is sort of fresh and short and appealing and right there when you are consuming the information, essentially, right? When I was at the Post, we had this one thing that I thought was really successful was when the Ukraine war first broke out, we did little videos from the people in the field because we had some research that showed that no one had any idea that we had foreign correspondents in Ukraine. They thought they were all just sitting in Washington, blogging, basically, right? And I think that for a place like Reuters, who has really incredibly talented, skilled, and committed journalists in gazillions of countries, right? Like, leveraging that is something that I think could theoretically break through to that, although not trying to be Pollyannish about it.
I think it's a really good question, and one of the most striking things in the report that maybe gets skated over a little bit is that the US now sits in the same basket as a country like Brazil. And we're really used to comparing the US with media markets in Europe, for example, but that's a completely outdated way of looking at it. And that stat that the US is more like Latin American countries in both its polarization and its sort of level of social media use for news is I think really striking. And how you break into the political bubbles around these platforms is a challenge. I mean, for us at the BBC, we see ourselves as a place in the market where anybody can come and everybody can trust, and our impartiality and our fairness and our fair approach is fully behind that. And luckily, we are one of the few outlets which is still trusted by both Republicans and Democrats. How we leverage that position to break into some of these bubbles it's difficult. Like I think we can't really shy away from how difficult that is. Actually, both on the right, which as you noted is driving a lot of the sort of influencer reach, but also on the left. And if people are switching off and pulling back into these safe bubbles where they can just follow people who repeat what they believe and tell stories that match whatever worldview you want to choose, an organization like us that can sort of cut through that, and like Reuters and the Times, and tell people what is really going on based on journalists that we have on the ground all around the world, is really important. But how we do that, I think we'd be silly to say this is kind of an easy answer, I think.
Sorry, I want to make sure we get some questions in. So sorry, this is such a rich discussion, and so many of these we could have whole panels on. But I want to make sure we have a question here at the back.
Okay, hopefully my voice is loud enough. I wanted to ask, we've been talking a lot about how, things impact political coverage or objective news coverage, but I'd love to know, this is something that, I'm from Business Insider, by the way. We think a lot about how generative AI search results are changing what coverage areas will allow us to reach people, whether it's people on this side or that side or upside or downside. So I'd love to hear how you all and your organizations are thinking about what coverage areas to invest in, not just platforms, like you made a really good point, do you invest in the platform? But what coverage areas are you investing in that maybe go beyond the polarization?
Start. I think, obviously, wellness, climate, things that are, well, I think there's a way to do climate that isn't polarized. That's more just like, there's some sort of like, how do I live a life that is, X, Y, or Z or something like that, right? I think also, but I don't want to say, lifestyle. I think that there's also a way to just like the accessibility of what you're doing when you're doing coverage areas. That's what my little Congress example is. I think it's very hard to get anyone except people like you to read a traditional narrative or a traditionally written or even traditionally broadcast story about what the tax bill in Congress, right? And I think the only way into that is to make it relevant and accessible to people. So for example, today we have a story that looks at whether the tax bill is really, a generational fight between the young and the old, right? And and I was like, yes, that's a framing on the bill that is going through Congress that could actually potentially break through. Now, do we write it in an accessible enough way? I don't know. But I think that there are ways to look at even traditional content areas that make it more accessible and more sort of informal and that sort of thing. Although I do think that, obviously Caroline should talk about this because the Times has many content areas, right?
I mean, I feel like our biggest, most powerful kind of subject area that transcends the political polls is sports. I mean, we made a huge investment in The Athletic, and I know, I'm a huge sports fan, and I know that when the sort of intensity of polarization in this country and the ferocity of the politics, sports is just a wonderful kind of place to kind of just exist for a while. Go crazy about your teams, get really invested in things that don't really ultimately matter, but they matter to you. And I feel like part of what we wanted to do with The Athletic is to be in a lot of households that might not think of themselves immediately as New York Times households.
And it channels, right? It channels that tribal polarization whatever we have in our DNA that makes us join teams, but in a non-violent political way usually.
Let me offer one from the research side. Perhaps slightly less so in this country, but certainly in the UK and a fair number of other countries we looked at, the pandemic created a moment where a lot of people engaged with news that was important for them personally, in addition to being of public importance, that was covered through a mix of experts they recognized as experts, nurses, doctors, scientists, and individual citizens like themselves who were not read through their lens of being, this is a Republican voter from Iowa in a diner, but like, this is a citizen experiencing something that you or someone like you could or is in fact experiencing right now. And there was a very high level of engagement with that coverage. And the moment where it often sort of the wheels came off that was when it was repoliticized, of course, actively by politicians, but also in a lot of countries, what happened was that the political correspondents and political editors got their greasy mitts on the story. And started narrating it through the lens of party politics. And that's where a lot of people zone out. And we've also seen, this is slightly more anecdotal, but in a number of cases I've heard local newspapers report really considerable success of re-engaging communities when they focus on issues that are considered important but not partisan in the community. For example, loneliness as a crisis in a lot of communities. That is a way of sort of building something where you report, you bring voices together, it's fact-based, you're not sort of taking sides, but you're speaking to something that's important that doesn't address people through their tribal identities or political identities. More questions? Oh, sorry. Please, at the back.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm with Digiday. I think it's really interesting seeing this data that's showing what, like you said, we all know that younger people are consuming news through social media and video, which, as you made a really good point, doesn't really drive referral traffic, right? And hearing you guys talk about the strategy behind this, it really sounds like there's a focus on deepening relationships with readers by, making news more accessible, producing video that's, easy to watch or listen to or, whatever. Does that also reflect like a change in the measurements of success? Like, are you looking more at loyalty and, deeper sort of engagement metrics than just reach, because it's getting harder and harder to drive traffic back to news sites?
I mean, I'll offer one from the research side, and then I'd love to hear responses from anyone who want to bite on this. I mean, I think one of the things that is fundamentally different about a lot of the voices that are thriving by doubling down on distributed reach on platforms, whether they're influencers or, for that matter, politicians, social movements, strategic communication, any other kind of sort of expressive activity, is that they don't try to monetize the content through an environment they control, right? It's loss leading if you're a politician or a civil society organization or whatnot. You're not thinking about monetizing the content at all. You're expressing yourself for other purposes, and platforms are perfect for that. And if you're an influencer, generally the monetization is either through a mix of sort of sponsorship or through Patreon and other systems that are separate from owning the destination, right? So all of that works really well from the point of view of lots of people who don't have a business built in the 20th century. But it doesn't work well if you do, right? So that, I think, is really, really hard. And we haven't really, I think, seen very many publishers, even the most sort of self-consciously digitally born 21st century new ones, really make that work for them without beginning to lose sight of some of the sort of standards that Sally and others have highlighted around conflict of interest and what is it really that you're doing. So that's the way I think of it as a researcher, that the complementarity is just a lot clearer for a lot of other voices. And the public, I think, is pretty clear about this. I mean, a lot, not all, but many influencers are pretty clear about what's sponsorship and that you go to Patreon or somewhere else to give them money, right? And people aren't confusing what the motivations are of a politician sounding off on a social media platform. People aren't stupid. But it's not clear that it works for the business models of a lot of other publishers.
I mean, go ahead. I think that a lot of the metrics are still emerging, and the moment sort of forces us to do something that we don't do well in newsrooms, which is to be patient and to understand audience behavior and whether one leads to the other, and to what degree do you have to invest in non-platform content to eventually drive people to your own website or to your app. And sort of that feels like it's still emerging right now. And I'm not sure that we really have the perfect metrics for it.
I think it's a really good question because we've talked a lot about reach on and off platform, but as a public service media organization, we have to go well beyond reach. In the UK, we measure relevance. We measure to what extent do you feel the BBC is for you. And that's a hugely important part of us delivering our public mandate, that people feel that we are delivering content and information that enriches their lives. Internationally, of course, we want to reach as many people as possible, but we also, take totally different metrics depending on where we are. We're in Afghanistan, and we're in emergency situations. We run an educational service for children in refugee camps, providing, to fill in the gaps when they've been pulled out of school. So we have all these kind of non-reach metrics that are hugely important to a global public service media organization like us, that go well beyond just raw reach. And in the UK, we have to demonstrate value. So this, I think, we haven't really talked about AI much, which is interesting, but the whole sort of, reach is dead. It's all about engagement. It's really not a binary choice for probably any of us. It has to be always both of those things, and we have to measure the engagement as well.
Yeah, I was just going to play off of something Carolyn said, and you kind of said it too. I mean, think about what your question that you asked, which you asked in very specific, but then think about that in the context of AI, right? Like, I mean, I think that we don't have any idea yet what AI is going to do to, both our journalism and our business models, which are obviously connected, but sort of two separate things. And I think sometimes we just forget like just how disruptive of the environment is around us. And so I sort of feel, Carolyn said maybe the metrics we have to actually have some patience and see a little bit how this plays out. I feel that way about AI. I think we have to stay on top of AI. We have to let it, we have to be as sort of proactive and aggressive as we can be. But none of us, and sort of, do like the first phase as well as we can. But none of us actually have any frigging idea what it's going to do to us, or to the way that people consume news, or the definition of news, or anything 12 years from now, let's say, for example. I mean, as short of a period as that. And so I think we are really in an industry where you sort of like, you try to keep a long view, but you're just trying to deal with this, and then you have to be flexible enough, and you have to, like, your standards are constant and everything else is flexible, essentially. And you just have to kind of say, over this hurdle, then the next one. And because we don't necessarily know, like, I don't feel that even the smartest people in our world actually understand how AI is going to play out and so it's just unknowable. And so we just have to be flexible is part of, and I think that's the kind of, those are the teams we have to build, is smart people who don't panic, basically, sort of.
Can I build on that a little bit? I mean,
Sure.
My name is Brian Carmona, by the way. I'm the head of standards for NBC Universal. And obviously I agree, because my job is the standards have to remain constant. When I look at the sort of influencer breakdown and that the right is so well served, there's clearly a gap on the left, and there's like a total absence of nonpartisan voices, I think, in that world. But it seems like it's not just a quest for people to confirm your worldview, it's also like a quest for people who look and sound like the people you might see, like at a bar or in your neighborhood. How far are we as traditional news organizations willing to push the envelope in terms of style and presentation and being more conversational and maybe breaking outside? I mean, this is less of a standards issue and more of a style issue, but it seems to me like we have to be a lot more flexible on that front if we want to address that market and try and tap into that a little bit as a business.
I mean, I feel like we have to be direct. I feel like we have to be human. we need to be conversational, but we don't want to lose sort of our expertise. We don't want to lose our journalistic identity. I feel like we have taken a bunch of steps, even in the time I've been at the New York Times, to sort of lose the stodginess and the kind of traditions of print, which were very kind of, we are going to speak to you from the mountaintop, and hopefully you understand this narrative or this way that we speak. But now we say things like, good morning. You know, you may not know overnight that this happened and that happened, and just sort of emphasize our humanity without losing our journalistic authority, because that's what people are paying us for. And it feels like we're just sort of trying to define that line. But I feel like we've gotten a lot better at it as we've moved onto these other platforms, especially audio. I feel like audio allows you to do both. You can really show off the depth of your reporting, but you can really be a human. You can be empathetic. You can be curious. And I feel like that really works in terms of building an intimate connection with readers and building trust.
I want to make sure we're respectful of everyone's time, and I think that the original plan was to wrap this up about 11:15. So I will end with one final question, which I'll sort of put the panelists on the spot, just to hear your thoughts on this. I'm going to tell you a secret, which is that my scientific view is that you're all going to be fine. It's not going to be easy, but your organizations have everything that's required to be able to succeed in this changing environment, in part because you are very good at serving people like me, right? Again, who are willing to reward you with attention, with money often, and in some cases support public service media and sort of accept that social compact. But I am really struggling to see all that many examples of success that come out of timeless journalistic and editorial standards that are succeeding at serving people who are poor, who have low levels of formal education, who are part of minoritized groups, who live far from metropolitan centers. So even leaving aside the politics of this, and just thinking about sort of classic social inequality, age too, but we can even stick with very classic forms of social inequality. Can you give me some examples of where you see hope for sort of forms of journalism that deliver on the aspiration of being for the whole public? And not that there's anything wrong in serving people like me. Look, don't get me wrong. I mean, I enjoy that. But what about the majority, basically?
I mean, there are a few signs of hope. I do think in some cases, the New York Times has served as almost, I felt like government did not give urgent, readily available information during COVID, for example. And the New York Times basically spun up a COVID tracker that anybody in another state, in any state, could get to. There was no paywall. You could get information about your state. It was updated constantly, and it was authoritative. I feel like The Daily, there's no paywall. A lot of young people listen to it. It's a way to get exposure to our journalism before you subscribe. And I feel like even some of the YouTube offerings, we have Ezra Klein, who is more popular among people in a bunch of demographics. In those, you can kind of expose yourself to before deciding to subscribe and becoming, part of the demographic that you're describing. If you're young and you just want to get better informed, you can subscribe to one of our newsletters. There's no cost of doing that. So I feel like there are a lot of mechanisms beyond paying for our journalism that can kind of get you into that world if you're curious about it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you are right that we are all essentially sort of, big global news organizations. So I think a lot about local news just because, number one, I've worked at, wire services, including Reuters that sell news to local news organizations. So I would say a couple things. First of all, I think the influencer thing that I was talking about is a way to, like, if we know that people are going to get news from influencers, whether we like it or not, they're going to do that, then I do think, like, as an industry or as a profession or as, like, people who support journalism schools or people who support nonprofits, or we should probably all think about whether training for influencers is something that does actually make sense, right? Because there's some realities that are coming at us that we should just pay attention to. I think the second thing is that there are a lot of really interesting nonprofits in, like, for example, the United States that are local. They're all really, really struggling to get past sort of the first blush of success and scale in any way, right? And so I personally, outside of my day job, am involved in some efforts to try to figure out, like, how do these places come up with sustained business models going forward that, I also hope that they, subscribe to Reuters News. But I think that there's a real inflection point in nonprofit local journalism in the United States that's coming at us, where they've all had some success. They're probably still traditional. They're probably not informal enough, like in their presentation and things like that. But they all have like a little bit more credibility with hyper-local, communities. And if they could find sort of sustainable financial paths going forward, I think that would be really interesting. And maybe then they have alliances with, they get news from, or graphics which they can never afford from us or something like that, or they have a network with the New York Times or something like that. But they're not necessarily going to survive unless they figure out the next 10 years, right? Because they've all started and done well, but the scaling is really hard, and they're all really like at inflection points. And so that's something that I think that as an industry and profession we should pay attention to, is how do they get over that hump, basically. Not a total answer, but it would be better than nothing. Let's put it that way.
I'll be quick because we're running out of time. Just two things. I think we talk a lot about local journalism. I think Mill Media in the UK is a really good example of, if you haven't heard of it, check it out, of a company that is doing some really interesting work in that space. But I think you're right, Rasmus. It is a challenge for all of us, particularly in this country, to reach people without tertiary educations and lower income members of the public, and particularly when you don't have the kind of public service media organizations at scale that you have in Europe, or at the level of market sort of reach. But just one thing to say on because we act in the sort of public interest, we are investing in things, globally in particular, that are designed to purely reach populations in need, in conflict zones. We run a Gaza emergency radio service that reaches hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza. That obviously has no revenue goal, but it's something that we provide because it's part of what we see as our purpose globally. And I know that's a unique example and something unique to the BBC, but I think it's sort of worth noting as something that is happening, even despite all the challenges you kind of talk about.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that is that that's sort of your answer about why you have to be in all these spaces, because like it's not like we can talk about philanthropies, but the actual real thing is to just make sure that, like, if we don't allow our journalism to be in imperfect spaces, then it's not going to reach the people you're talking about. So I think that's one reason for us not to pull back, but to be as expansive and inclusive. I mean, inclusiveness doesn't necessarily mean be liberal inclusive. It might mean be non-liberal inclusive. So I'd say that.
With that call for being expansive and inclusive, let's thank our panelists and Richard and Paul for having us today.